Every human being carries within them a shadow, the hidden, repressed part of the psyche that holds what the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. It is the accumulation of suppressed emotions, unhealed wounds, and unaccepted truths. The shadow is not evil by nature. It is simply everything we have exiled from awareness because it threatens our self-image. When this hidden aspect remains unintegrated, it begins to control us from beneath the surface, shaping our perceptions, our relationships, and the ways we react to others. When people betray someone who has been loyal to them, the root often lies not in rational choice, but in the projection of their shadow. Projection is a psychological defense mechanism where individuals attribute to others the traits, motives, or emotions they cannot face within themselves. The loyal person becomes a mirror reflecting back the disowned parts of the betrayer's psyche. Instead of confronting their inner contradictions, they attack the mirror. Betrayal becomes a means of silencing what their soul refuses to confront. To understand this dynamic, we must recognize that loyalty itself carries a symbolic power. It represents integrity, reliability, and emotional maturity, qualities that threaten those who are still ruled by their unhealed selves. The shadow despises what it cannot embody. When a loyal, consistent presence enters the life of someone dominated by ego or fear, that person begins to feel exposed. Their manipulations, insecurities, and double standards no longer hide in the shadows because loyalty brings light. And the moment the light shines too brightly, the unhealed psyche feels cornered, suffocated, and subconsciously seeks destruction as escape. Thus, betrayal emerges not as an act of cruelty alone, but as an act of psychic self-preservation. The betrayer does not consciously think, I will harm this person because I cannot face myself. Rather, their unconscious mind pushes them to act out what they refuse to feel. They might convince themselves that the loyal person is too much, too intense, or too demanding. They will craft justifications for their behavior, blaming, criticizing, or distorting reality to protect their ego from collapse. But beneath the rationalizations lies the same truth. The loyal person became a threat because their presence evoked shame, inadequacy, or envy. This is why betrayal often comes from those we have helped the most. The very qualities that make one loyal, empathy, consistency, selflessness, can unconsciously trigger resentment in others who feel incapable of matching that level of authenticity. The betrayer projects their inner failure onto the loyal one. They begin to believe the loyal person is secretly manipulative or self-righteous. In reality, they are describing their own shadow. The more they suppress their feelings of guilt or inferiority, the more they externalize them. Their psyche whispers, it's not me, it's them. Betrayal becomes their final act of denial. The projection of the shadow does not always manifest in overt hostility. Sometimes it appears in subtle withdrawal, coldness, or passive aggression. The betrayer may distance themselves without explanation or fabricate reasons to justify emotional abandonment. These are all unconscious attempts to eliminate the person who reminds them of the parts they cannot reconcile. The mind, when threatened by self-awareness, seeks to destroy the messenger instead of decoding the message. Loyal people, on the other hand, often fail to see this process. They interpret betrayal as a personal failure, as if their kindness was misplaced or their trust undeserved. But it is never about their worth. It is about the other person's inability to coexist with a reflection that demands emotional honesty. The loyal soul acts as a mirror of conscience, and many cannot bear to see their distortions laid bare. The greater your inner clarity, the more violently those lost in confusion will resist your presence. The shadow projection dynamic explains why betrayal often feels irrational. You can do everything right, support someone through their darkest moments, stand by them when everyone else leaves, and still become the target of their disloyalty. It is not logic that drives such behavior, it is emotional displacement. When someone is full of self-loathing, they must direct that energy somewhere, and it often lands on the person who least deserves it, the one who made them feel safe enough to unconsciously reveal their chaos. The tragedy is that both people suffer. The betrayed loses trust, while the betrayer loses connection with their own humanity. But one carries pain that leads to awakening, while the other sinks deeper into denial. The loyal person, though wounded, has an opportunity to see beyond appearances, to understand that what was done to them was in truth done by an unconscious force acting through the other. Such awareness transforms the pain into insight. The projection of the shadow reveals itself through repetition. If we observe patterns of betrayal in our lives, it often signals that we are being called to confront something deeper. Perhaps our own boundaries, attachments, or illusions about people's capacity for truth. The shadow of others interacts with the unhealed parts of ourselves. If we are attached to being the savior, the loyal rescuer, we attract those who unconsciously wish to destroy that image, forcing us to evolve beyond it. Every relationship becomes a mirror between two unconscious worlds. The more light one brings, the more darkness will emerge to meet it. This is the nature of psychological balance. The shadow resists exposure because light means transformation, and transformation demands death. The death of falsehood, ego, and illusion. Those unwilling to die symbolically through self-awareness will instead attempt to kill the truth outside them. Hence betrayal. To truly comprehend why people betray, even when you are loyal, one must see beyond moral judgment and into the architecture of the human psyche. Betrayal is not random. It is a reflection of inner conflict externalized through action. When you become the embodiment of integrity, you inevitably awaken the shadow in others. Some will integrate it and grow beside you. Others will project it and turn against you. But in every case, the betrayal is the shadow's desperate attempt to remain unseen, to preserve the comfort of ignorance over the discomfort of awakening. There exists a subtle but powerful psychological phenomenon that governs many betrayals and emotional disconnections. The fear of emotional debt. It is not often spoken of, yet it silently drives countless human interactions, shaping relationships in ways neither person consciously understands. Emotional debt arises when one person gives love, loyalty, or support that the other feels incapable of returning. It is not the act of receiving kindness that wounds them, but the inner realization that they cannot reciprocate it with the same depth or sincerity. And rather than face that discomfort, they choose escape. Often that escape manifests as betrayal. When someone is deeply loyal, generous, and emotionally consistent, their presence becomes a mirror that reflects another's emotional incapacity. The loyal one gives without calculation. They love because that is their nature. But to the emotionally underdeveloped or self-protective psyche, this kind of unconditional giving feels threatening. It awakens guilt, inadequacy, and even resentment. The receiver begins to feel that their emotional world is being measured against a higher standard, one they cannot or will not meet. To preserve their self-image, they create distance. And in extreme cases, they break the connection altogether, not because they were harmed, but because they could no longer bear to feel indebted to goodness. The human mind struggles with imbalance. It desires equilibrium, even in emotional exchanges. When someone gives more in trust, care, or forgiveness, the imbalance becomes unbearable for the one who cannot give equally. Gratitude requires vulnerability, humility, and acknowledgement of one's own limitations. But for the ego-driven or emotionally avoidant person, such vulnerability feels like weakness. They would rather reinterpret your loyalty as manipulation than admit they feel small beside it. In this way, the psyche transforms appreciation into suspicion and devotion into threat. It is easier to betray you than to remain in silent debt to your love. This dynamic is particularly visible in relationships where one person acts as the stabilizing force, the anchor. The other, often emotionally turbulent or self-centered, feels subconsciously dependent on that stability. They begin to perceive the loyal person not as a companion, but as a reminder of their dependency. What once felt safe starts to feel suffocating. Their ego whispers, you owe them too much, you've lost your freedom. So they rebel, they betray. They fabricate reasons to justify their withdrawal, all in an effort to reclaim a sense of independence they never actually lost. But beneath this rebellion lies fear, the fear of emotional debt. To accept love fully means to accept the responsibility it implies. Love at its core demands presence, empathy, and emotional accountability. For many, these demands feel unbearable because they threaten the illusion of self-sufficiency. The betrayer, unable to repay the depth of loyalty they've received, convinces themselves that the loyal one has ulterior motives. This projection protects their pride while concealing their internal imbalance. It is not that they do not value loyalty, it is that they cannot emotionally afford it. Emotional debt often begins to build the moment a relationship becomes uneven in energy exchange. Imagine a person who constantly receives understanding but offers none, who is forgiven repeatedly but rarely apologizes, who takes comfort in your stability but panics at the thought of being needed in return. Each act of loyalty they receive reminds them of their emotional insolvency. They know, consciously or not, that they are living off the currency of another's compassion. Instead of gratitude, they feel pressure. Instead of peace, they feel exposure. This discomfort metastasizes into resentment, a twisted emotional logic that turns your love into their burden. This is why betrayal from those you've cared for most feels so confusing. You gave everything with sincerity, yet they left you questioning what you did wrong. The truth is, your consistency made them feel indebted in a way they could not process. To betray you was for them a form of liberation. They believed that by hurting or rejecting you, they were freeing themselves from the unspoken weight of owing you emotional repayment. What they don't realize is that betrayal does not erase debt, it merely transfers it to the realm of conscience. But for the moment, it feels like relief. The fear of emotional debt is deeply rooted in the ego's resistance to humility. The ego wants to be admired, not indebted, praised, not corrected. When it receives genuine love or forgiveness, it feels small, vulnerable, even exposed. To admit indebtedness means acknowledging one's own emotional incompleteness. The loyal person simply by being authentic, disrupts the ego's illusion of independence. The betrayer cannot stand that disruption. Their mind rationalizes their betrayal as self-protection, but it is in truth sabotage born from internal guilt. This fear also thrives in individuals who equate emotional exchanges with control. To them, every act of kindness carries a hidden motive. They assume everyone operates on transactional logic because that is how they relate to others. When they meet someone who gives selflessly, they don't see love. They see a threat to their worldview. Their suspicion grows. Why are they so loyal? What do they want from me? They cannot comprehend sincerity because it exposes the superficiality of their own emotional depth. Betrayal then becomes their attempt to level the field, to destroy what feels too pure to be trusted. Over time, this cycle perpetuates itself. The loyal person continues to meet people who mistake generosity for control, and the fearful continue to sabotage connections that require vulnerability. The fear of emotional debt ensures that authentic loyalty is met not with gratitude, but with avoidance or betrayal. The more selfless the giver, the greater the receiver's internal turmoil. Emotional debt corrodes the bond from within, transforming affection into tension, admiration into envy, and love into something unbearable. This fear does not only exist in romantic relationships, it manifests among friends, families, and even colleagues. Whenever one soul gives more than the other can reciprocate emotionally, the shadow of debt appears. Some will rise to meet it, growing through humility and gratitude. Others will run from it, disguising their fear as detachment or resentment. The tragedy is that many betray not because they are malicious, but because they are terrified of facing what love requires of them. To accept unconditional loyalty means to surrender pride, to acknowledge one's emotional limits, and to give up the illusion of control. For some, that surrender feels more threatening than betrayal itself. The ego is the mask the self wears to survive in a world that constantly demands conformity, validation, and recognition. It is a psychological armor constructed through experiences, expectations, and social conditioning. Though it gives structure to identity, it also becomes the greatest barrier between who we appear to be and who we truly are. When the ego encounters authenticity, whether in another person or within oneself, it feels endangered, as if its survival depends on destroying or discrediting that truth. This inner tension is the hidden root behind many acts of betrayal, deception, and emotional distance. Authenticity is a mirror that reflects the truth of being. It is unfiltered, honest, and deeply alive. Yet to the ego, authenticity is intolerable because it threatens the false sense of self it has worked so hard to maintain. The ego thrives on external approval, while authenticity arises from inner alignment. When a loyal, genuine person enters the life of someone ruled by ego, their presence becomes an existential threat. The ego senses exposure. It feels seen beyond the mask, beyond the pretenses that sustain its illusion of control. The authentic person does not play by the ego's rules of manipulation or validation, and this disrupts the unconscious equilibrium that the ego relies on to feel superior or safe. Betrayal often occurs at this psychological crossroads. When the ego cannot dominate or outshine authenticity, it resorts to destruction. It may distort reality, manipulate perception, or sever ties altogether to regain control over its crumbling illusion. The ego's hostility toward authenticity is not logical, it is instinctive. It reacts as if its very existence is under attack. The more genuine and self-aware you are, the more threatened the egocentric person becomes. They will accuse you of arrogance when you are merely confident, of manipulation when you are merely clear, and of selfishness when you are simply protecting your peace. This reaction reveals a deeper truth. The ego does not hate authenticity because it is false, but because it cannot imitate it. The ego can mimic charm, empathy, or humility, but it cannot embody truth. Authenticity does not seek attention, it radiates naturally. It does not manipulate perception, it invites transparency. The ego, in contrast, depends on external reflection to exist. It needs to be admired, envied, or feared to maintain its identity. When confronted by someone whose worth is not determined by others, the ego feels irrelevant. To restore its sense of superiority, it attacks the source of discomfort. Hence, loyalty is met with betrayal, love with resentment, and honesty with rejection. In relationships, this dynamic unfolds subtly. A loyal, authentic person may believe that their sincerity will inspire others to do the same, but the ego interprets such purity as exposure. It sees every genuine act as a spotlight revealing its artificiality. The loyal person's transparency begins to irritate, then provoke, and finally threaten. The ego whispers, they think they're better than you, they're judging you, they're trying to control you with kindness. These whispers turn affection into competition and intimacy into emotional warfare. The betrayer does not realize that they are projecting their own insecurities. They believe they are defending themselves from domination, when in truth, they are defending themselves from authenticity itself. The ego's resistance to authenticity stems from its dependence on illusion. To be authentic means to live without masks, to be vulnerable, accountable, and self-aware. But vulnerability is unbearable to the ego because it requires surrender. It demands the acceptance of imperfection, the humility to admit error, and the courage to exist without performance. Most people fear this exposure. They have built their identity around achievements, roles, or social status, fragile constructs that collapse under the weight of truth. So when someone embodies what they cannot, they instinctively push it away. The ego would rather betray love than risk its dissolution in authenticity. This is why genuine individuals often become targets of envy or misunderstanding. Their calm presence, their refusal to engage in superficial games, their capacity for empathy, all of these qualities unsettle those who depend on egoic validation. The authentic person reminds others of what they have buried, the yearning to be real, the longing to live without pretense. Instead of awakening, most choose resistance. It is psychologically safer to invalidate the authentic than to dismantle the false self. And so betrayal becomes not merely an act of rejection, but a defense mechanism, a desperate attempt to preserve the illusion of superiority and control. The ego's threat response is rooted in fear, the fear of annihilation. To the ego, authenticity feels like death because it dissolves the boundaries between the image and the reality. When one acts authentically, there is no performance left to hide behind. The ego loses its stage, its script, its applause. It ceases to be the center of perception. The individual becomes transparent, grounded, and free. But for those still enslaved by egoic identity, this freedom looks like loss. It appears as chaos because they cannot comprehend life without comparison or control. When they encounter someone who has found peace within themselves, They mistake it for superiority, arrogance, or emotional detachment. The more authentic you become, the more the egos around you will be forced to reveal themselves. Some will be inspired to evolve, others will rebel violently. The ego cannot coexist peacefully with authenticity because one feeds on illusion and the other exposes it. The loyal person, rooted in self-awareness, embodies stability. The ego-driven person, addicted to validation, feeds on instability. When stability enters their life, they lose their usual sources of drama and emotional fluctuation. What once felt stimulating now feels threatening. They begin to sabotage the relationship, seeking to restore the chaos that reassures their identity. This sabotage is not always conscious. The betrayer may not know why they feel the urge to distance themselves or create conflict. Their psyche is reacting instinctively to the authenticity that reveals their inner fragmentation. They may start testing boundaries, questioning motives, or manufacturing reasons to doubt your loyalty. The deeper truth is that they are trying to provoke you into breaking character. To prove that your authenticity is a farce aid, when you remain consistent, when you continue to act from truth rather than ego, they feel powerless. Betrayal becomes their final attempt to regain psychological dominance. The ego's threat to authenticity is the core struggle of human relationships. It is the eternal conflict between illusion and truth, between the need to appear and the desire to be. Every act of betrayal that arises from this conflict is a form of resistance against awakening. The authentic person does not conform to the ego's world of masks, and the ego, sensing its demise, retaliates with rejection. Distortion and deceit. It is a war fought not between people, but between consciousness and illusion, between the light of awareness and the darkness of identity. There exists within the human psyche a paradox that few recognize, but many act out. The unconscious rebellion against goodness. It is the hidden resistance that arises when one encounters purity, kindness, or integrity that surpasses the capacity of one's own self-acceptance. It is the silent revolt of the unhealed self against what it perceives as a moral or emotional mirror too bright to look into. When goodness enters the life of someone still governed by shame, guilt, or unresolved inner conflict, it becomes intolerable. What should evoke gratitude instead awakens resentment. The person begins to sabotage, reject, or betray that goodness, not out of conscious malice, but out of a deep psychological discomfort with what it reflects. Goodness exposes contrast. It silently reveals the distance between who someone truly is and who they pretend to be. A genuinely good person, someone who is loyal, compassionate, and self-aware, does not need to prove their worth. Their mere presence reveals the pretenses of others. To a person ruled by ego, pride, or self-deception, that presence is suffocating. It exposes hypocrisy without accusation. It calls forth accountability without words. And so the unconscious mind, unable to bear the internal dissonance, begins to rebel. It does not want to destroy the good person per se. It wants to destroy the reflection of its own inadequacy. This rebellion begins subtly. The betrayer might start by questioning the motives of the good person. They may whisper to themselves, "No one can be that genuine. There must be something manipulative behind it." Suspicion grows where trust should reside. Gratitude turns into cynicism. Their mind begins to rewrite reality to justify the discomfort they feel. It becomes easier to believe that goodness is an illusion than to accept that they have fallen short of it. The unconscious mind seeks equilibrium, and when confronted with moral or emotional imbalance, it chooses to pull the other down rather than rise to meet them. This rebellion against goodness is not born from strength, but from fear. Genuine goodness forces the ego to confront its falseness, to acknowledge the ways it has lied, manipulated, or concealed truth to maintain control. The ego resists this confrontation because it equates goodness with vulnerability. To be good in the authentic sense means to surrender control, to allow transparency, to live in truth without defense. The unhealed psyche associates such surrender with danger. It remembers moments when openness led to pain, when kindness was exploited, when vulnerability became weakness. So it learns to distrust goodness, not just in others, but eventually in itself. When someone loyal and kind enters the life of a person driven by fear or ego, their presence unconsciously threatens the delicate balance that keeps that person emotionally functional. The loyal one brings peace, honesty, and predictability, qualities that should nurture connection. Yet, for the one living in chaos, this stability feels unnatural. They are accustomed to emotional volatility. They equate drama with depth. The quiet steadiness of goodness feels empty to them because it offers no familiar stimulation. They begin to create conflict as a way to reintroduce the emotional tension they are addicted to. The unconscious rebellion has begun, the psyche restoring its preferred form of suffering. At the heart of this rebellion lies self-rejection. People who cannot accept their own goodness cannot truly accept it in others. They will unconsciously seek to corrupt or dismantle what reminds them of what they have denied within themselves. The pure-hearted person becomes an unspoken challenge. Why can't you be like this? Why do you hide behind pride, deceit, or control? These questions are never spoken aloud, but they echo in the mind of the one rebelling. To silence the echo, they must distance themselves from or betray the one who awakened it. The rebellion against goodness also exposes the deep confusion between purity and power. Many equate goodness with weakness because it lacks aggression or pretense. In truth, genuine goodness is the highest form of strength. It requires inner stability and self-mastery. But to the ego, which thrives on dominance and performance, such quiet strength feels alien. It cannot comprehend power that does not need to assert itself. So it rejects it. The ego feels small in the presence of authentic goodness, and to protect itself, it attacks what it cannot become. This attack can take many forms: betrayal, belittlement, or emotional withdrawal. Some may mock or ridicule goodness, masking their discomfort with humor or sarcasm. Others may seek to test it, pushing boundaries to see if the good person will finally react, break character, or reveal hypocrisy. It is a psychological experiment born from insecurity. The rebelling psyche wants proof that goodness is an illusion because that proof would justify its own cynicism. If the good person remains kind, despite mistreatment, the ego grows more enraged. The rebellion intensifies because continued goodness exposes continued falsehood. The unconscious rebellion against goodness reveals the inner war between light and shadow within every individual. The more unresolved pain one carries, the harder it becomes to coexist with authenticity and kindness. To accept goodness means to admit that healing is possible. And that admission threatens the identity built around suffering. Many people have unconsciously bonded with their wounds. They derive meaning, control, or sympathy from them. Genuine goodness disrupts this dynamic. It offers liberation, But liberation requires letting go of the very patterns that keep the ego in control. To avoid that loss, the psyche rebels. This rebellion is not limited to individuals. It can be observed in groups, societies, and even families. In every environment, the presence of one truly authentic person destabilizes the collective illusion. Their truth becomes uncomfortable, their empathy unsettling. Others may label them too sensitive, too idealistic, or too naanve, not because they are wrong, but because they expose the falseness that everyone else is trying to maintain. The more one embodies integrity, the more they trigger rebellion in those who have built their lives around compromise. What makes this rebellion unconscious is that those acting it out genuinely believe they are right. They rationalize their betrayal or rejection of goodness as self-defense. They tell themselves that the good person was controlling, manipulative, or unrealistic. In truth, they are projecting the parts of themselves they cannot face. Their rebellion is not against the person, but against the awakening that person evokes. Goodness reminds them of the responsibility of consciousness, the obligation to live truthfully, to love without pretense, and to confront the falseness within. The mind resists this responsibility with all its might, choosing betrayal over transformation. The unconscious rebellion against goodness is, therefore, a symptom of unintegrated shadow, a reflection of the psyche's refusal to reconcile its darkness with its capacity for light. When goodness enters the life of one still ruled by pain, it calls forth everything that resists healing. The betrayer does not rise to meet it. They fall away from it, consumed by the inner storm that goodness quietly revealed. Betrayal is one of the most piercing experiences in human existence. It dismantles the illusions we cling to about others, about love, and most painfully, about ourselves. Yet within this shattering lies an ancient alchemical process, the transformation of consciousness through suffering. The soul, when wounded by deception or disloyalty, is forced into a descent, a dark night of disillusionment where false attachments burn away. What remains is not the same person who once trusted blindly, but someone who begins to see with new eyes. The pain of betrayal, though devastating, becomes the crucible in which awareness is refined and reborn. The process begins with the collapse of certainty. Betrayal destroys the psychic ground we thought was stable. It breaks our sense of safety and belonging. In that initial shock, the ego cries out, "Why me? How could they?" The world that once felt predictable suddenly feels hostile and unfamiliar, but beneath this chaos lies an invitation, a call to awaken from illusion. Every betrayal, no matter how personal or cruel, exposes the fragile structures of attachment that we mistake for love. It reveals how much of our peace depended on external validation and how deeply we trusted others to hold what we were meant to hold within ourselves. The alchemy begins when we stop seeking justice from the outer world and start seeking understanding within. At first, the impulse is to blame, to see the betrayer as the sole cause of our pain. But as time unfolds, the deeper layers of truth emerge. We realize that betrayal does not create our wounds, it exposes them. The pain was already there. The longing to be chosen, the fear of abandonment, the need to be seen. The betrayal simply illuminated what had remained unconscious. It brings to the surface every dependency, every illusion, every unhealed part of us that gave another power over our inner state. Through this revelation, betrayal becomes a mirror. It reflects the ways in which we betray ourselves The times we silenced intuition, ignored red flags, or settled for less than mutual respect, we see how often our desire to be loved made us blind to truth. This realization is brutal, but it is also sacred. It marks the death of naivety and the birth of discernment. True awakening begins not when we forgive the betrayer, but when we reclaim the parts of ourselves that handed them the weapon. This is the essence of spiritual alchemy, the transformation of base emotions into wisdom. Pain, when observed consciously, becomes a source of insight. Betrayal forces introspection. It strips away egoic illusions and demands that we confront what is real. The loyal soul learns that love without self-respect is submission, that compassion without boundaries is self-erasure, and that trust without discernment is an invitation for pain. The fire of betrayal burns these lessons into memory, not as bitterness, but as clarity. As we descend deeper into the wound, the ego resists. It clings to the story of injustice, to the identity of the victim. Yet the soul seeks transcendence. The alchemical process requires that we move beyond vengeance and self-pity, not by denying pain, but by understanding it. The fire must burn until the false melts away. When the ego's narrative dissolves, something remarkable occurs. The pain becomes impersonal. We begin to see that betrayal is not merely an isolated act of cruelty, but a universal human pattern born of unconsciousness. Everyone betrays and is betrayed at some point because everyone struggles between fear and authenticity. This recognition does not excuse the act, it transforms its meaning. It shifts the focus from punishment to awakening. In this awakened state, we start to perceive the betrayer differently. We no longer see them as the enemy, but as a messenger of truth. Their actions reveal the hidden dynamics of our attachments. They force us to confront the illusions we use to maintain connection. In this sense, betrayal becomes a spiritual teacher, a painful but necessary initiator into maturity. It teaches us that love without consciousness is dependency, that loyalty without reciprocity is self-harm, and that forgiveness without awareness is surrender to repetition. The alchemy of awakening through betrayal is not instantaneous, it unfolds in stages. First comes shock, the breaking of illusion. Then grief, the mourning of what was lost and what was never real. Then anger, the burning energy that demands truth. And finally, understanding, the moment when the fire cools and the gold emerges. This gold is inner sovereignty, the realization that no one holds power over your peace unless you grant it. Through betrayal, you begin to see where your energy has been leaking into illusions, where your love was offered without alignment, and where your loyalty was rooted in fear rather than authenticity. This transformation changes the entire structure of consciousness. Before betrayal, love is often idealistic, an emotional projection built on hope and desire. After betrayal, love becomes grounded, discerning, and self-aware. The awakened heart does not close, it evolves. It learns to give without losing itself, to trust without expectation, and to love without attachment. The loyal person who once sought validation now seeks truth. The knave heart becomes the wise heart, not cynical, but awake. Every stage of betrayal, when met consciously, refines perception. We begin to see human behavior with compassion, not blindness. We recognize that betrayal is often the symptom of inner fragmentation, that those who deceive others first deceive themselves. This understanding does not erase pain, but it transforms it into wisdom. We no longer carry the wound as a mark of shame, but as a symbol of initiation. It signifies that we have seen through illusion, that we have met the shadow face to face and chosen not to become it. The alchemy of betrayal ultimately transforms suffering into insight, pain into presence, and loss into liberation. What was once an act meant to break you becomes the force that awakens you. It teaches that no betrayal from another can destroy you unless you betray yourself. And when you finally cease to do that, you step into a consciousness that cannot be shaken by deceit, rejection, or loss, for it is built not on illusion, but on truth.